It's really my great privilege to be here this evening for the first Joan and Henry Katz lecture in Judaic Studies. This lecture series, which will continue for several years and hopefully more, was made possible through the estate of the late Henry Katz. Henry and his wife Joan were great supporters of Fairfield University's Bennett Center, both financially and personally. They regularly attended lectures sponsored by the Bennett Center, always came to our annual donor reception, and faithfully attended the 8-week Lunch and Learn class, co-sponsored by the Bennett Center and the Federation for Jewish Philanthropy of Upper Fairfield County. Joan enrolled first, and then, several years later, Henry joined her in the Lunch and Learn class, continuing to attend the class for many years, even after Joan's death. Joan and my mother went to the same high school, James Madison High School in Brooklyn, at just about the same time. Joan was a year younger than my mother. And their discovery that they had both gone to James Madison created a special kind of bond between them. It also strengthened the connection that I had already felt to Joan and Henry. When I first thought of whom I might bring to campus to deliver the first Joan and Henry Katz lecture, I immediately thought of Christine Hayes, the Robert F. and Patricia R. Weiss Professor of Religious Studies in Classical Judaica at Yale University. Most of our speakers brought to campus by the Bennett Center, most of our speakers this year have focused, just mostly coincidentally, on either the late Middle Ages or the modern period in Jewish history. Some have focused on Jewish literature, but again, our literature lecture was on modern Jewish literature, and we had someone, seems so long ago, Michael Marmer came in October and talked about the late Abraham Joshua Heschel. And so I wanted to bring in a scholar for tonight's lecture whose field of expertise would be historically earlier. And I thought of Christine Hayes, whose work I've long admired, but whom I had not previously met. Dr. Hayes is a major figure in the academic fields of Hebrew Bible, the history and literature of Judaism in late antiquity, Midrash, and rabbinic and Talmudic studies. An internationally acclaimed scholar and author, she's active in such professional organizations as the Association for Jewish Studies, for which she currently serves as president. And she's a member of the International Advisory Board for the University of Antwerp Institute of Jewish Studies. She is the author of more articles than I could possibly mention tonight, and the author of several books, including the award-winning What's Divine About Divine Law, Early Perspectives, The Emergence of Judaism, Classical Traditions in Contemporary Perspective, and Between the Babylonian and Palestinian Talmuds. She is editor of Judaism and Law, recently published by Cambridge University Press, and Current Issues in Priestly and Related Literature, The Legacy of Jacob Milgram and Beyond. And I forgot to mention this, Chris, so even though we've never met before, we do have a connection. You wrote on Jacob Milgram, really the world's authority on the book of Leviticus. His daughter, Shira, has been my rabbi for more than 30 years. Christine Hayes recently served as co-editor of the Association for Jewish Studies Review and is editor and author of the rabbinic section for the Encyclopedia of the Bible and its Reception. Her talk tonight focuses on her current research on rabbinic humor. Dr. Hayes received her BA degree, summa cum laude, from Harvard University with a major in the study of religion. She then began graduate school at the University of California in Berkeley, earning her MA and PhD degrees in Talmudic and Judaic studies. During the more than 20 years that she's been a faculty member at Yale University, she's also been an affiliate in the Center for Jewish Law and Contemporary Civilization at Cardozo Law School in New York City, a faculty fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America, and a visiting professor on the law faculty of Tel Aviv University in Israel. And this semester, is it a fellow? in law school, right, at the University of Pennsylvania. My thanks to David Zeef for helping to make this lecture series possible, and to Jennifer Hanos, Program Manager of the Bennett Center, for taking care of all the many details that needed to be attended to in order to make tonight's event happen. And last, my thanks to Christine for coming up from Philly to be here with us this evening. And so now, at this time, please join me in formally welcoming to Fairfield University to deliver the inaugural Joan and Henry Katz Lecture in Judaic Studies on the topic, Can We Laugh at God? Humor and Truth in Rabbinic Judaism, Dr. Christine Hayes.
Thank you very much, Professor Umansky, for that very warm welcome. I also want to thank Jennifer, who has handled all of the logistics for this event so beautifully, and to the wonderful, supportive friends and donors in your community. I had the pleasure of joining many of them for dinner, and I really thank you for making possible this event. Some of you may be familiar with Umberto Eco's historical murder mystery, The Name of the Rose, in which the elderly, blind, laughter-hating monk Jorge of Burgos, who serves as the monastery's secretive and controlling librarian, hides a work that he considers to be dangerous on an apocalyptic scale. The work in question is the sole surviving copy of the long-lost second book of Aristotle's Poetics, in which the great philosopher discusses laughter and the virtues of comedy. Footnote, it is true that Aristotle refers to a book on comedy. We don't know that he wrote one. If it did, it certainly didn't survive antiquity. So Umberto Eco is picking up on that fact and saying that it was destroyed, all but one copy, and that copy is the center of his book, The Name of the Rose. In the film version of The Name of the Rose, Jorge explains the subversive power of laughter to the Franciscan friar William of Baskerville moments before the book and Jorge and the entire monastery go up in flames, which is why we do not have a copy of Aristotle's comedy. The dialogue is in the first part of your handout number 1. William asks, "Venerable brother, there are many books that speak of comedy. Why does this one fill you with such fear?" Jorge responds, "Because it's by Aristotle." William, "But what is so alarming about laughter?" Jorge, "Laughter kills fear, and without fear there can't be any faith, because without fear of the devil there is no more need of God." William, "But you will not eliminate laughter by eliminating that book." Jorge, "No, to be sure, laughter will remain the common man's recreation. But what would happen if, because of this book, learned men were to pronounce it permissible to laugh at everything? Can we laugh at God? The world would relapse into chaos. Can we laugh at God? Indeed. And would the world relapse into chaos if we did? It was Charles Baudelaire who said, "Holy books never laugh to whatever nation they belong." So he seems to share with many the belief that reverence kills humor. Things we think are very, very important and that we have reverence for, we can't laugh at, and humor, in return, kills reverence. But Charles Baudelaire, I would venture to say, never read the Talmud. Had he done so, he would have seen that the Talmudic rabbis did indeed laugh about and sport with God. Why? What is the reason for the humor and playfulness of Talmudic literature? This is the question that will occupy us this evening. And to succeed in finding an answer, we need to spend a few minutes first thinking about humor. What exactly is humor? Why does the same event strike some people as humorous and others as not at all humorous and even shocking? Well, the most widely accepted theory of humor is the incongruity theory, which holds that humor is found primarily in an intellectual recognition of an absurd incongruity between conflicting ideas or experience. According to one scholar, John Morial, humor is, and these are the elements he lists, it is first of all a cognitive phenomenon, something we think about, a cognitive phenomenon in which perceptions, thoughts, mental patterns, and expectations undergo, second, a sudden change of cognitive state or a cognitive shift, that is, third, abrupt or sudden, and 4, pleasurable. So he summarizes those 4 features in a pithy statement. You'll see this at the end of the second point on your handout. In humor, we enjoy cognitive shifts. We enjoy cognitive shifts. So he improves on standard incongruity theories of humor by explaining why we do not laugh at all incongruities and why we do not all laugh at the same incongruities. Not all cognitive shifts or incongruities are experienced as pleasurable. He explains that there are in fact two basic responses to incongruity. The first is a negative reaction that can range from great distress and fear to puzzlement. Great distress arises when we perceive an incongruity as a dangerous violation of the proper order of things, a bomb on the front seat of your car. It's an incongruity and you're probably not going to laugh, right? Or something that violates our values, like a parent that abuses a child. This is not funny. It's incongruous and it's not funny. Puzzlement arises from an incongruity that's not perceived as dangerous or threatening, but is still odd and puzzling and can irritate us, like when I found my house keys last week on the curb outside my house. That bothered me, it puzzled me, it was an incongruity, and it left me feeling uneasy. Whether dangerous or merely puzzling, if these incongruities disturb us or annoy us, we do not find them amusing, and we even work to end them, resolve them. And we share that response to incongruity with all of the animals, right? When animals or dogs see someone they don't know in a house, they have those fearful or distressed reactions. But humans alone have the second response to incongruity, and it's a positive response. When an incongruity is perceived as non-threatening, we can enjoy it. Moreover, we have no desire to end or resolve it. On the contrary, because we're amused, we're motivated to prolong and repeat it. So incongruity has always provoked and continues to provoke these two basic categories of response in human beings globally. Certainly what constitutes incongruity is sometimes culturally specific, but once we identify incongruity in a particular cultural context, we can look for clues to determine whether that incongruity is perceived as disturbing or puzzling. Do people work quickly to try to end it? Or as amusing and enjoyable? Do they work to prolong it? Sometimes we see one group in the culture will react with distress, and one group will react with delight to the same incongruity. The contrast tells us who has a sense of humor. So now back to the ancients. After the 3rd century BCE, before the Common Era, so I refer to before 0 as BCE and CE as after. After the 3rd century BCE, ancient Jews were confronted with a great incongruity. An incongruity that prompted responses ranging from distress to delight and humor. And I want to trace the story of that incongruity here and the different reactions that it prompted among different groups of ancient Jews, and then we'll come some distance towards understanding the reason for the centrality of humor in the rabbis' interactions with the divine. There were two very different conceptions of divine law, the Greek conception and the biblical conception, that lie at the base of Western civilization. To the extent that the ancient Greeks and the biblical writers conceived of the divine in radically different ways, their notions of divine law also diverge dramatically. And that's a fact with very severe consequences for those who felt compelled to negotiate the incongruous claims of both of those cultural heritages, the Greek and the biblical. What did it mean in antiquity to say that law was divine? Well, in most Greek thought, divine law is divine because it represents or expresses the profound structure of a permanent natural order. The Stoics were the first to use the phrase divine law, theos nomos, to refer to what we think of today as natural law. Against centuries of Greek tradition before them, the Stoics saw centuries of tradition before the Stoics that saw nature as chaotic, the Stoics asserted that no, there is a rational order to nature, a logos, something that animates and governs the universe. For the Stoics, because they believed that God was nature was God, nature was divine, therefore the unwritten and eternal rational order or logos embedded in nature was divine law. So natural law and divine law were the same for them. The later Roman thinker Cicero describes the Stoic theory of natural or divine law, and that's number 3 on your handout. True law, meaning divine or natural law, is right reason, orthos logos, in agreement with nature, diffused over everyone, consistent, everlasting, whose nature is to advocate duty by prescription and to deter wrongdoing by prohibition. There will not be a different law at Rome and at Athens, or a different law now and in the future, but one law, everlasting and immutable, will hold good for all peoples and all times. So for the Stoics, divine law is rational and therefore true and universal and eternal and unchangeable. It's static in its perfection. And very important, it's unwritten. It is just just reason itself. It's not a written set of rules conveyed in words or statements. It's the unwritten rational order of the cosmos. No human law can invalidate it or restrict it or annul it any more than a law could invalidate gravity. This is a debate we still have in America today. People who feel that they must obey the natural law written on their hearts and sometimes not human written law. This comes from the Stoics and from Cicero. The perfectly rational human, were such a one to exist, and they really don't, the Stoics felt, but the perfectly rational human would perceive the divine rational order in nature and would cleave to that rational order and attain moral virtue and happiness. So Stoic thought, and indeed Greek and later Roman thought in general, assumes a very important dichotomy we will have to keep in mind that is not true for the Bible. On the one hand, they believe there is natural and divine law, and on the other hand, quite separate and distinct from the natural law embedded in nature, there are human positive laws of states, the laws that human beings and human societies posit, positive law. It consists of concrete rules and prohibitions written by human beings, delivered in writing in words and sentences, and enforced by the coercive authority of the state. Positive law isn't universal. It's particular to a given city or state. It's subject to change and evolution over time. It doesn't necessarily reflect truth or eternal reality. I don't stop at a red light because there's something about redness that makes me stop, but because we agree to that, and I could change it tomorrow and make it something else. We need the positive laws of states because we lack the rational perfection needed to comprehend and follow the divine natural law embedded in nature. According to Plato, the truly rational man or philosopher who can perceive the eternal rational truths embedded in the universe would simply conform his behavior to the natural order and live justly, never in need of the laws of his state. But most of us lack that rational perfection, and so instead, we have to institute written laws that coerce us to a basic civility, not true virtue, which assumes rational perfection, just an obedient civility. The positive laws of our cities and our states are therefore a kind of second best option, and even the best written laws are viewed negatively in the Greek philosophical tradition. Positive human laws may bring obedience, but they do not cultivate in us a true moral virtue that comes from the rational love of the good and the just, rather than fear of punishment. Indeed, Plato says that the written laws are rather imperfect and require a savior, a soter, in the form of logos, or reason, if they are to really win our fidelity and bring basic civility. So if you were to ask an ancient Greek, what's divine about divine law, they would have answered that divine law is divine by virtue of certain qualities inherent in it. First and foremost, its rationality. It is reason, which entails its truth value, and that truth is absolute. And its universality, because reason is ever and always the same, and its static, unchanging character. By contrast, in biblical tradition, the law is divine not by virtue of any inherent qualities, but because it emanates from a God who is the master of history. Biblical divine law, meaning the legislation and instruction given to Moses at Sinai for the Israelites, the Torah, is divine because it's authored by, it's the command of a deity. It's not the expression of an impersonal, natural, or divine reason, the rational order of the cosmos. Divine law in the Bible is a body of actual rules and commandments emanating from a divine being that express his will. Its authority is grounded not in its rational or true quality, but in its commanding source. On your fourth item on your handout, Moses went and repeated to the people all the commands of the Lord and all the rules, and all the people answered with one voice, saying, all the things that the Lord has commanded we will do. And Moses then wrote down all the commands of the Lord. This divine law is written. It's not a rational order. It's concrete legislation formulated in words, and it's designed for a particular community. Indeed, when God gives the divine law at Sinai, he says that by obeying the laws, the Israelites will be separated out from other nations to be his people, to be distinct from others. And for that very reason, the law contains some arbitrary, irrational rulings that are not universally observed, particularly dietary laws and purity laws that will precisely mark off the Israelites as distinct from others and in covenant with their God. And because the divine law in the Bible is a positive enactment of the divine sovereign's will, it is changeable, since what comes from an act of will can be changed by a subsequent act of will. New rules and ordinances can be issued as long as there's continued access to God's will. In biblical times, this is achieved by going back and asking God what he means. 4 times Moses has to do that when something comes up and he doesn't know what the ruling should be. He says, hold on, let me go ask God. And it happens after Moses' time, when in Deuteronomy 17, God says, look, after Moses goes, this is how you will decide what the law is. You will consult the authorities of the day, and so on. In biblical tradition, the variability of the divinely given law in response to the shifting circumstances of human life is part and parcel of the divine law, quite explicitly so. Deuteronomy 13 says, you're entering the land now, so we're going to change things. You're no longer going to offer sacrifices whenever and wherever you like. You're going to do it at one central place that I will choose. Deuteronomy 17 says, now that you're entering the land, you might decide you want a king, and if you do, these are the procedures you will follow. The best, of course, is Numbers 27, where we have the legal claim of the daughters of a man named Zelophehad. These daughters who have no brothers come to Moses and they say, why should we not inherit just because our father had no sons? Why should his property go to his brothers? The daughters should inherit when there are no sons to inherit. And Moses takes this to God, and God says, you're right. We really should change things, Moses. Let's write that down, he says, and do it that way. And so Moses makes a note of that. New situation, new rules. So in the dominant biblical discourse or representation of divine law, it's not the only one, but it's the dominant one. That's all I have time to focus on. The divine law is represented as expressing God's will for a particular people, not universal mankind, in the form of a written law that makes them fit for life in a particular place. And rather than expressing a fixed rational order of timeless, universal, static nature, it's subject to change through historical time as needed. So ancient adherents of biblical tradition would have answered the question, what's divine about divine law, by pointing to its origin in a divine will, a will expressed in history rather than nature. The attribution of divinity to the law didn't in and of itself necessarily confer upon the law any specific qualities such as rationality, conformity to truth, universality, immutability. Some laws of the Torah are rational and some clearly are not. Most are particular to Israel, some and not universal, and some are adjusted as the need arises. So you see we have 2 different and incongruous discourses of divine law in antiquity, and they collided after a young 23-year-old named Alexander decided to conquer the eastern end of the Mediterranean. And Hellenistic culture began to pour into the lands where Jews lived. And this created an incongruity or a cognitive dissonance for Jews living under Hellenistic rule from the 3rd century BCE on. Why did they feel a cognitive dissonance? Because on the face of it, the divine law of biblical tradition possesses many of the features that Greek thought would attribute to human law, and not so much the features that Greek thought attributed to divine law. If you look at number 5 on your sheet, I have a chart which shows you what Greeks thought about divine law, the characteristic traits of divine law on the left side and human law on the right. So divine law conforms to truth, or it is truth. It's grounded in reason, or it is reason itself. It's universal, unchanging, immutable. It's eternal and unwritten. Human positive laws don't necessarily conform to truth. They're just laws, and they're grounded in the will of the sovereign, and they're particular, and they can be changed, and they're flexible, they're temporary, and they're even written. And the biblical tradition's laws looked a lot more like what you see in the right side of the chart. And that incongruity between Greek and biblical conceptions of divine law was obvious to ancient Jews, and they responded in different ways. So the first response that we will consider is the response of Hellenized Jews. In other words, these are Jews who fully embraced and internalized Hellenistic values, the Hellenistic conception of divine law. Yes, a divine law should be unwritten, rational, true, universal, and immutable. These Jews, can you imagine whether they would find the incongruity funny or not funny? Were they distressed or amused by the incongruity? They were distressed, right? They did not find the incongruity amusing. They were puzzled or distressed by the fact that the divine law of their beloved tradition, the Torah, was written legislation. It didn't seem to deal with truth. It even contained non-rational commandments like the dietary impurity laws. It wasn't immutable, really, and it seemed flexible. It got adjusted as historical time proceeded, and it was particular to the Israelites and not universal. These Jews were certain that the incongruity between the Greek conception of divine law that they so admired and the Jewish Torah, which they so loved, would inspire their Greek neighbors to ridicule them. Embarrassed and distressed by the incongruity, they sought to end it by denying it. Thus, in the face of those who might find the Mosaic law's incongruous nature rather ridiculous and would mock it, these Jews insisted that there was nothing to laugh at. The divine law of biblical tradition given to Moses at Sinai actually possessed all of the qualities of divine law as defined by the Greek philosophical tradition, all those things on the left side of your chart. It could and it should be revered as universal, rational, true, and immutable, and not laughed at. Some of these Jews conveyed their ideas in fictionalized accounts of debates between a Jew and a non-Jew or non-Jews. And those non-Jews would represent the Greek perspective, and then they would have a Jewish character or hero in response. So the non-Jewish character in these writings would point to the incongruity between the Hellenistic idea of divine law and the biblical Torah of Moses with bemusement or puzzlement or mockery. They would especially single out the irrational and particular dietary and purity laws as proof that the law cannot be divine. Why would a God care what you eat, right? So in the 2nd century BCE, we have a work called the Letter of Aristeas. And here in this work, non-Jewish philosophers express curiosity, puzzlement about the dietary and purity laws, since these prohibitions seem to contradict both nature and reason, and a divine law should be consistent with nature and reason. The Jewish hero of the letter, named Eleazar, states as follows, and this is number 6 on your handout. No, he says, in each and every case there is a profound logic for our abstinence from the use of some things and our participation in the use of others. Do not accept the exploded idea that it was out of regard for mice and the weasel and other such creatures that Moses ordained these laws with such scrupulous care. Not so. These laws have all been solemnly drawn up for the sake of justice, to promote holy contemplation and the perfecting of character. So according to Eleazar, the creatures labeled unclean, he goes on to say, serve as symbols of undesirable qualities or unjust behaviors that should be avoided. So there's nothing arbitrary or random about the dietary laws and the laws of purity. Indeed, the Mosaic law is divine in the Greek philosophical sense, which means it's rational and it's true, but it's an allegory, and one must decode its allegories to reveal the deep and completely serious truth. Aletheia, truth, the right reason, and the righteousness at which each law and the system as a whole takes aim. So he says in number 7 on your handout, the legislation was not laid down at random or by some caprice of the mind, but with a view to truth and as a token of right reason. And so he bids us not, by misusing the power of reason, to resort to injustice. And he goes through and he gives an example of why certain birds are prohibited because they're raptors, and that's teaching you not to be violent in nature. And we only eat the gentle doves and chickens who never hurt anybody. And so it's to inculcate these moral behaviors. So he says, the points I have briefly run over have shown you that all these norms have been regulated with a view to justice, and that nothing has been set down through Scripture heedlessly or in the spirit of a myth, but rather in order that throughout our life and in our actions we practice justice towards all men, being mindful of the sovereignty of God. All that is said of food, then, and of unclean creeping things and of animals is directed toward justice and just intercourse or interrelations among men. So another apologetic defense of the Mosaic law is found in a work called 4th Maccabees. Now, this is a work from the late 1st or early 2nd century of the Common Era. It's from Alexandria or Antioch, we don't really know. But it also depicts a dialogue between a Jew and an outsider. This time the outsider is hostile. It's a cruel tyrant, Antiochus, and he's mocking the Jewish protagonist, Eleazar, for adhering to dietary laws that he says are silly. They're opposed to nature and reason. The law of the Judeans, he claims, has nothing to do with truth. It's senseless and therefore assuredly not divine. We see this in number 8 on your handout. Why should you abhor eating the very excellent meat of this animal when nature has provided it? For it is senseless not to enjoy delicious things that are not shameful, and not right to decline the gifts of nature. But you seem to me to do what is even more senseless if, because you cherish a vain opinion concerning the truth, you continue to despite me at the cost of your own punishment. He was trying to force him to eat pork. Will you not awaken from your silly philosophy, dispel the nonsense of your reasonings, and adopting a mind worthy of your age, pursue a true philosophy of what is beneficial? Well, Eleazar responds, this is number 9. Even if, as you suppose, our law were in fact not divine, and we wrongly considered it to be divine, not even so would it be possible for us to invalidate our reputation for piety. You scoff at our philosophy as though our living by it were not sensible, but it teaches us self-control, so that we overcome all pleasures and desires. And it also exercises us in courage so that we endure all pain willingly. It trains us in justice and it teaches us piety. Therefore, we do not eat defiling food, for believing that the law is divine, we know that the Creator of the world shows us sympathy by imposing a law that is in accordance with nature, right? Taking the Stoic notion of what a divine law is. It's in accordance with nature. He has permitted us to eat what will prove suitable for our souls, but he has forbidden us to eat the flesh of what will prove contrary to us. Interestingly, Eleazar and the tyrant Antiochus actually agree on what it is for a law to be divine. They both accept the Stoic definition according to which a divine law must be truth, it must be rational, it must be in harmony with true nature. Their only dispute is whether the law of the Judeans possesses those qualities so as to rightly be called divine. Antiochus responds to the incongruous elements in the law, all of these non-rational dietary and impurity laws, with puzzlement and abuse and ridicule. He resolves the incongruity in a way by just declaring that a law with such irrational elements just can't be divine and doesn't deserve any respect. Eleazar, on the other hand, is distressed by the incongruity, but he resolves the incongruity by simply denying it. The dietary impurity laws, he urges, are rationally devised to inculcate the 4 cardinal virtues that you Greeks so admire: justice, courage, self-control, and most of all, prudence, and even piety. This is the mark of the true philosopher. There's no incongruity between Judean law and Greek divine law. Don't laugh at us. Our last example of an ancient Jewish author who found the incongruity between the Stoic conception of divine law and the biblical conception disturbing is Philo. Philo was a 1st century Alexandrian Jewish philosopher. As a member of the Jewish legation that was dispatched to plea for the case, the political rights of the Jews, to the Roman Emperor Caligula in the early 1st century, Philo experienced the derision of foreigners directly. He records in his work called The Embassy to Gaius, which talks about this political legation that went to see Caligula. He records that when the Jewish legation appeared, the Roman courtiers began to mock the peculiar customs of their Jewish visitors. And just as in the letter of Aristeas and in 4th Maccabees, they zero in on the dietary laws. This is number 10 on your handout. But after giving some of his orders about the buildings, he, Gaius Caligula, put to us this grave and momentous question: why do you refuse to eat pork? The question was greeted by another outburst of laughter from some of our opponents because they were delighted, and so on. Philo, too, knew that the biblical divine law was susceptible to mockery because it contained irrational and particularistic elements that were incongruous with prevailing Hellenistic notions or conceptions of divinity and what a divine law would look like. On many occasions in his writings, Philo attacks those who mock Scripture for what they see as fanciful myths or irrational laws and other elements that contradict the Stoic idea of what it means to be a divine law. In response, Philo vehemently asserts that the Hebrew Scriptures are, in fact, divine according to the Stoic notion. He writes, this is number 10, the next one in number 10. Thus, whoever will carefully examine the nature of the particular enactments or commandments will find that they seek to attain to the harmony of the universe and are in agreement with the principles of eternal nature. So he identifies the Mosaic law with the divine natural law, and then goes on to claim that, identified with the natural law, it possesses the properties and the qualities of natural law. First, he says, it contains rational and philosophical truth. This is the next phrase. In every respect, the holy writings are true, he writes. The Bible must not be dismissed as mere literature. In the next section on your handout, he writes, in the poetic work of God, you will not find anything mythical or fictional, but the canons of truth all inscribed. So it is truth, he says. Second of all, biblical divine law is not the law of a particular people. It's the universal law of the entire world city. And one day all nations, he says, will lay down their particular laws and follow the universal law currently observed only by the Jews. Third, he asserts rather astonishingly that the law is immutable. It has never changed from the time it was received by Moses. Fourth, and I think most astonishingly of all, Philo takes up the matter of the Torah's writtenness, which in Stoic tradition, writtenness is an unfailing sign of human law, right? Only human laws are written down, rules and commandments. The natural law is reason itself. And he asserts that the written text we have of the Mosaic Code is actually just a copy or an icon of the original unwritten law of nature. And he knows this because the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, observed the law before it was given in writing at Sinai. So, how were they able to do this? Because it's natural law, and they were sages with rational perfection, and the rationally perfect sage can just read the divine natural law written in nature. So if the patriarchs followed the Torah before it was given in writing, and Philo says that they did, I don't think he read Genesis very carefully, then that's because the Torah is the natural law, and they knew it from simply observing nature. In short, Philo's answer to the distressing incongruity between the Greek idea of divine law and the biblical representation of the Torah or divine law, an incongruity that led his Hellenistic neighbors to ridicule the Torah of Moses and deny that it was divine, his response was to deny the incongruity altogether by refashioning the Torah of Moses as the natural law. For Philo and many other Hellenized Jews who accepted the Stoic definition of divine law and wanted their law to be respected by the culture they so admired, the Torah of Moses had to be refashioned as absolute truth, utterly rational, universal, and immutable. But not all Jews reacted negatively and apologetically to the obvious incongruity between the philosophical conception of divine law and the biblical conception. And this brings us then to the Talmudic rabbis. These are rabbis who flourished from the late 1st to the 7th century in Palestine and in Babylonia to the east. They too were aware of the incongruity, and they were generally speaking unapologetic. We know this because they too composed dialogues and stories that depict outsiders mocking some of the features of the biblical Torah of Moses as being kind of irrational and so on. But unlike the Hellenistic Jewish writings that we've seen, the rabbis were not in general distressed by the incongruity and the mockery it inspired. And so they didn't rush to remove it by asserting that there is no incongruity and the law of Moses is indeed rational truth, universal and immutable. Why? Because they simply didn't accept the Stoic definition of divine law. So how does this work? For the rabbis, the divine law was the written legislation given to God's covenant partner at Sinai, aimed at establishing a just political order for a particular community in a particular place and evolving through time to meet that community's changing needs. So instead of refashioning the Torah of Moses to match the Stoic definition of natural divine law, the rabbis signaled their rejection of the Stoic definition by doubling down on the incongruity and even intensifying it. Against the Stoic conception of divine law, they reasserted the biblical portrait of divine law as a written body of legislation given at Sinai that doesn't claim to be rational truth, doesn't claim to be universal and immutable. The resulting portrait of divine law as something that can sometimes deviate from truth and rationality, sometimes in need of modification or repair, can be pretty funny to those with a Stoic sensibility, and that's precisely how the rabbis wanted it. Theirs is a very positive and accepting laughter, the point of which is to remind us that while God is true, truth is not God. What does it mean to say that truth is not God? It means that truth, though highly prized, is not absolute and sacrosanct. Only God is. Indeed, according to the rabbis, sometimes God defeats truth, forcing it to yield to other values. We see this in a famous rabbinic legend about the creation of humankind. As God is considering whether to create humans at all, according to this legend, the angels debate the issue. The angels are love, truth, righteousness, and peace. 4 angels who are debating whether or not God should go ahead and create humankind. This is number 11 on your handout. Rabbi Shimon said, when the Holy One, blessed be he, came to create Adam, humankind, the ministering angels formed themselves into groups and parties, some of them saying, let him be created, while others argued, let him not be created. And this is what is written in Psalm 85:11. There's a verse there that says, love and truth are found together, righteousness and peace combated each other. The rabbis are reading this as a reference to angels with those names, and they're arguing with one another, right? Love said, let him be created because he will dispense acts of love. Truth said, let him not be created because he's compounded of falsehood. Righteousness said, let him be created because he will perform righteous deeds. Peace said, let him not be created because he is full of strife. What did the Lord do? He took truth and cast it to the ground. Said the ministering angels before the Holy One, blessed be he, sovereign of the universe, why do you despise your truth? The word here is probably a Hebrew form of aletheia, the Greek word. Let truth arise from the earth. That's why the very next verse in that psalm says, let truth spring up from the earth. In other words, they're reading the psalm, and it says, love and truth are found together, righteousness and peace combated each other, let truth spring up from the earth. And that prompted them to create this story, that there were groups of angels arguing about the creation of man, and God took truth and cast it to the ground, which is why the next line in the psalm is the angels turning and saying, truth, get up, where God's thrown it down. Rav Huna, the elder of Sepphoris, said, while the ministering angels were arguing with each other and disputing with each other, the Holy One, blessed be he, created man. And then he said to them, what are you arguing for? Man's already been made. Humans can exist only if God silences truth and acts in love. Moreover, we learn that their continued existence depends on God's continuing to overpower truth. For were God to judge humans by the standards of truth, they wouldn't stand a chance. That's why the rabbis say it's best to come before God in judgment in the second part of the day. Because in the first part of the day, the first 3 hours of every day, he's studying and he's occupied with sort of abstract truth. And no one wants to receive a judgment based on abstract truth. In the second part of the day, he gets up off the throne of true justice and he sits on the throne of mercy. And then he's willing to weigh factors other than truth when rendering his judgment. That's when you want him to be listening to your plea. In many other texts that depict the heavenly courtroom where God sits as the judge and judges people, God is depicted as deliberately sabotaging the proceedings. In these very humorous stories, God urges various heavenly advocates to defeat his attribute of true justice, to talk me out of it, if you will, and abandoning any pretense of judicial impartiality. He even helps the advocates find ways to bribe him. Indeed, there's another passage which comments on a verse in the book of Isaiah. Isaiah 66, verse 7, where God says something about my house of prayer, right? You will go and you will be in the house of my prayer. And the rabbis say, why does he say my prayer, not their prayer? That's interesting. And so the rabbis conclude that God himself says prayers. And they ask, this is the next text 12 on your handout, well, if he prays, what does he pray? Rav Zutra Bartobi said in the name of Rav, this is what he prays. He says, may it be my will that my mercy may suppress my anger and that my mercy may prevail over my other attributes so that I may deal with my children in the attribute of mercy and on their behalf stop short of strictly correct or true justice. These humorous portrayals of God defeating or circumventing or seeking to overpower truth in his judgment of humans are intended to caution human judges against an overzealous attachment to truth. Indeed, deviation from strict or true justice in the interpretation of God's law in order to achieve some greater social good is often praised. One rabbinic passage notes that Torah judges who render justice in a formally correct way that ignores particular circumstances are deficient. An uncompromising adherence to truth, to the single correct answer that might emerge from abstract study or theorizing about justice, can be dangerous and can flatten mountains, they say. The pious judge will apply the laws of the Torah with a consideration for a range of values, not only truth, which is certainly a great value, but it is only one. And there is also compassion, modesty, peace, humility, charity. Sometimes these values must override truth when declaring a judgment under divine law. One rabbinic tradition states that Jerusalem was destroyed because the people gave judgments according to the true or formally correct law, when they should have, on occasion, waived their rights to a true or formally correct ruling. Further, interpreting and applying the laws of the divine Torah does not require a strict alignment with empirical facts or empirical reality. And statements to this effect can lead to fairly humorous results. There's a well-known and widely discussed example of this idea, that the law of the Torah can sometimes defy natural reality, which appears in an early 3rd century legal work called the Mishnah. Here in the Mishnah, Rabban Gamliel, so this is a leading sage, he knowingly accepts false testimony about the phases of the moon. The calendar was determined by eyewitnesses reporting on the astronomical sighting, the fading of the old moon and the beginning of the new moon, and 2 witnesses had to come and their testimony had to be accepted before you could declare the first day of the new lunar month. And witnesses come, and it's quite funny because they give patently false information, but Rabban Gamliel accepts their false testimony about the phases of the moon, and he sets the calendar based on this astronomically erroneous calculation. Now, his colleagues object. How can you say that this day is the first day of the lunar month when clearly that's not astronomically true? This is important because people will observe the divinely commanded fast of Yom Kippur on the wrong day, and they will consume food on the day that really is astronomically the Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And that's a sin that's punishable by death at the hands of heaven. So there's a lot at stake into saying what the calendar is. The holidays have to fall out correctly, and people have to follow the laws of those holidays on the right days. How can you declare that this is the first of the lunar month? But Rabban Gamliel prevails over the objectors, and the calendar is set in defiance of astronomical reality. Now, in the story, this mismatch between the court's calendrical ruling and the truth, right, the astronomical truth, the real calendar, evokes different reactions from different characters. So one rabbi, Rabbi Joshua, who objected, he experiences puzzlement and even a measure of distress, and he seeks to prevent the incongruity by insisting that Rabban Gamliel align the court's calendar and the sacred festivals with their astronomically correct dates. By the way, that was actually the view of the sectarian community that lived at the Qumran settlement near if you've heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Dead Sea Scrolls that come from this community, this sectarian community at Qumran, this was one of their issues. They objected to the calendar being drawn up according to the court in a way that defied astronomical reality. And we have some of their works and their writings that say you can't be a member of this sect unless you agree not to advance or delay the actual astronomical times of the festivals. So there was real stuff at stake for people here. So Rabbi Joshua is objecting to this, but others in the story accept the incongruity in a humorous spirit. Indeed, one rabbi, Rabbi Akiva, doubles down on the incongruity. He even demonstrates through a playful exegesis of some verses of the Bible that the rabbis have the authority not only to set God's calendar, but to do so when they are in error and even when they are deliberately in error. The following story, number 13 on your handout, also responds to the incongruous disconnect between the court's rulings and the astronomical reality with humor. Rabbi Chia once saw the old moon in the heavens on the morning of the 29th day. He took a clod of earth and threw it at it, saying, "We want to sanctify you tonight. We want to declare the first day of the new moon tonight, but you're still here. Go and hide yourself." Rabbi said to Rabbi Chia, "Go to Ein Tov and sanctify the month, and then send me the password, 'David, King of Israel, is alive and vigorous.'" I'll explain this in a minute. I want to read one more story, though. A little bit about this. In this tale, you have a 3rd century sage who hoped to be able to declare the new moon, presumably for reasons of convenience. And he's annoyed to see the old moon lingering, and so he chastises it. Rabbi advises him to go to some other town, Ein Tov, to declare the new moon so that nobody would really notice or think that it's odd, and then to send a coded message when he's accomplished this task. We have a final, equally amusing defense of the rabbinic declaration of the calendar in defiance of astronomical reality in this next text. This is number 14 on your handout. Rabbi Hoshaya said, "When the lower court, the court on earth, right, the human court, makes a decree and declares, 'Today is the new year,' then the Holy One, blessed be he, says to the ministering angels, 'Set up the tribunal, install the advocate, install the clerk of the court, for the lower court has decreed and declared that tomorrow is the new year, and now we do so too.' If the witnesses are delayed or the court reconsiders and puts it off to the next day, then the Holy One, blessed be he, says to the angels, 'Oh, take down the tribunal and dismiss the advocate and the clerk of the court, for the lower court has decreed that the next morning should be the new year.'" Rabbi Pinchas and Rabbi Hilkiah ben Rabbi Shimon say, "When all the ministering angels assemble before God and ask, Lord of the universe, when is the new year? He answers them, you're asking me? You and I should go ask the lower court. Literary markers of humor in both of these last two sources. The absurdity in number 13 of Rabbi Chia ordering the moon to disappear or trying to strike the moon by heaving a lump of clay towards it. There's wordplay. The name of the place that he's going to is Ein Tov, which can mean a good eye, literally a good eye, and yet that's where Rabbi Chia will pretend he doesn't see what he actually does see. And then in the other text, number 14, we have this incongruous portrait of ministering angels waiting around for the rabbinic court to declare the calendar, busily preparing for the court's ruling, only to close up shop when that ruling isn't forthcoming or is changed, as if time depends upon the actions of the human court. And finally, the hilarious portrait of a divine being who doesn't have a clue what time it is. Just as the divine law's deviations from truth didn't distress the sages, and in fact they doubled down on it and they tell stories in which God is defeating truth or the law differs from truth, so the law's deviations from rationality didn't distress them. Here too, instead of offering an apologetic defense, they double down. The rabbis acknowledge that the dietary laws and the purity laws are irrational, arbitrary, something that Aristeas and 4th Maccabees and Philo were exercised to disprove. For example, we see in text 15 on your handout, Rav said, the commandments were given only that humans should be tried or tested by them. For what difference does it make to the Holy One, blessed be he, whether one slaughters an animal by the throat or by the nape of the neck? Hence the commandments were given only that humans should be tried by them. What does he mean? He means that the dietary laws and similar laws are arbitrary. There's no reason for slaughtering an animal this way or that way. God really doesn't care. He doesn't need us to do it one way or the other. So what are they really? Well, they're kind of a trial of our obedience. They test our obedience because it's not easy to obey laws that don't really seem to make sense or seem arbitrary or irrational. And so they're there just to test us and provide us with an opportunity for obedience. Like Aristeas and Philo, the rabbis are clearly aware that irrational laws expose Israel to the mockery of the nations, but they won't offer an apology. It's not their Torah that has a problem. It's the mockers' conception of divinity that's the problem. There's a famous passage from a third century work called the Sifra, where the rabbis acknowledge that the Torah contains both rational laws and irrational laws. And they assert that the rational laws, such as the prohibition of murder or robbery or certain acts of sexual immorality, these, they said, we would know even if the Torah hadn't been given, right? We would be able to figure these out for ourselves. After all, every human legal system has prohibitions of murder, robbery, and some kinds of sexual immorality. And this shows that these are not the laws that really mark the Torah as divine. No, for the rabbis, the laws that mark the Torah as distinctively divine are precisely the irrational laws, the purity laws, the dietary laws, other ritual laws that are commanded only to Israel. Nobody else would have figured it out. Israel would not have come to this by themselves, and they mark Israel as the covenant people of God. This idea would have been anathema to the Stoics or the Greeks. For the Stoics and for Hellenized Jews like Philo who adopted their point of view, only that which is universal and immutable rational truth is divine, not the particular, the irrational, or the contingent. Finally, the rabbis felt no distress over the fact that the divine law of Israel is not immutable. Here again, they double down and they portray the laws of the Torah as susceptible to moral critique and modification. On many occasions of interpreting or applying the law, the rabbis will determine through logical argumentation what the divine law logically should be, and then they'll look at it and say we don't like it, and they'll set it aside in favor of what they maintain as a better ruling, better in the sense of morally better. We see this, for example, in that same 3rd century legal work I mentioned, the Mishnah. In one tractate, we have a list of a whole series of rabbinic ordinances that adjust the rulings of the divine law, as they say, for the sake of the social order, or to bring about more peace, or for the sake of the public welfare. In short, for the rabbis, divine law doesn't necessarily dictate the best and most desirable answer. It's a starting point, and humans are an essential partner in critiquing the law and making it better, usually based on an instinctive moral sensibility. Some texts are quite explicit in their criticism of some aspect of the divine law as morally inferior, and there are fascinating and humorous sources that describe God as being corrected by the moral insights and arguments of humans. 140 of these confrontational texts dating between the 3rd and the 7th centuries have been gathered and studied in a book called Pious Irreverence by Dov Weiss. Sometimes God rejects or ignores the critique, but sometimes, quite significantly, he admits his flaws. He adopts the more ethical stance that's proposed by his human interlocutor. He modifies his behavior, his decree, or his law in response. In text number 16 on your handout, we see that God concedes to Moses' criticism of the principle of intergenerational punishment, right? Punishing the children for the sins of the parents. When the Holy One, blessed be he, said to Moses in Exodus 34 when he was introducing himself, saying, I am the Lord, etc., who brought you out of Egypt, visiting the guilt of the parents upon the children, or visiting the punishment of the parents upon the children, right? So when the Holy One, blessed be he, said to Moses, I am the God who's visiting the guilt of the parents upon the children, Moses said, hold up, master of the world. How many evil people give birth to righteous people? Shall they take punishment from the sins of the parents? Terach worshipped idols, and Abraham his son was righteous. And also Hezekiah was righteous, and his father Ahaz was a wicked man, and so on. Is it appropriate that righteous people shall receive lashes for the sins of their parents? And God said to him, you've taught me something. By your life I will nullify my decree and establish your word, which accounts for why the prophet Ezekiel says, no more shall children die for the sins of their parents. Every man shall die for his own sin. So the rabbis also can account for that change in God's way of doing things, because Moses talked him out of it. Moses expresses moral outrage over the principle of transgenerational punishment, and God learns from him and annuls his decree and establishes a new rule of individual punishment. In another instance, Moses teaches God that it's best to sue for peace before engaging in a war, and God is said to adopt that policy in place of his earlier decree, allowing people to make war without first attempting negotiations. In another rabbinic passage, when Moses objects to the severity of punishment by death, of capital punishment for certain sins, God revokes the punishment and institutes just flogging instead, not a capital crime. In these cases, the rabbis tell stories and present modifications of divine behavior or divine law as a result of human input and revision. It's a short distance from the view that God consents to and is desirous of human assistance to modify the strict justice of his own decrees, to the view that he needs it. A very dramatic and I think humorous illustration of God's dependence on human intervention to defeat him in the execution of his own flawed decrees is found in the last passage. This passage refers to the golden calf story. So if you're familiar with that story, in Exodus 32, God is infuriated. He and Moses are having this wonderful tete-a-tete, and he's just handing over the Torah to Moses when the Israelites commit idolatry and adultery, actually, it's figured in both ways, with a golden calf at the foot of the mountain. God is furious, and he tells Moses to get down. The whole deal is off. He's going to lash out and destroy all of the people, and he offers to start again with Moses, right? But the main thing is he's so infuriated, he declares his intention to wipe the people out. He tells Moses to stand aside in verse 9, and then the next verse says, Vayachal Moshe, means, and Moses implored God. So God has just ordered him to step aside, I'm going to destroy them. But Moses quite courageously, Vayachal Moshe, he implores God. It's a very unusual word, though. And the rabbis pick up on this unusual word and the fact that it has many multivalent possible meanings. It could be related to the meaning of hechal, which means to annul an oath. Okay, so that's, I think, all the preparation you need to understand what's going to happen in this very interesting interpretation. So here's another explanation the rabbis say of this verse that says, but Moses implored, Vayachal Moshe, Moses implored the Lord his God. What does this mean? Well, it really means that he absolved the creator of his vow. That's a related word. Vayachal can mean absolve. How? Well, when Israel made the calf, Moses began to entreat God to forgive them, but God said, Moses, I'm stuck. Right? I already took an oath back there in Exodus 22:19, which if you were listening, I just told you 5 minutes ago. And it said that whoever sacrifices to a god other than Yahweh alone shall be destroyed, prescribed. And I can't retract an oath which has proceeded from my mouth. I'm really stuck. So according to Rabbinic Midrash, right, this interpretation, God desperately wants to forgive Israel, but he can't. He's trapped by his own law that condemns idolaters to death. So Moses thinks very quickly, and Moses said to him, Lord of the universe, read ahead now in Numbers 30. Didn't you grant me the power of annulment of oaths when you said in Numbers 30, verse 3, if a man makes a vow, he shall not break, he shall not yachel his pledge, meaning that is that he himself cannot break his pledge, but a scholar can absolve his vow if he consults him. And he goes on to say, every good teacher should always model his teachings to his students, so you really should be the first to make use of this law. I've left out lots of the conversation here. And so he persuades God to adopt this course of action. So then Moses is going to sit like a sage to hear God's petition for the annulment of his rash vow. And so the Midrash describes the scene. And I always imagine this in my mind. It's such a beautiful image, right? Moses wraps himself in his cloak, the cloak of a scholar, and he sits down like a sage. And God comes to him hat in hand, a petitioner standing there looking sheepish. And the Holy One, blessed be he, stood before him like one petitioning for the annulment of his rash vow. And what did Moses say to him? A shocking thing. Do you now regret your vow? And he said to him, I regret now the evil which I said I would do to my people. And when Moses heard this, he said, it is absolved for you, it is absolved for you. And there is neither vow nor oath any longer. He absolved the vow of his creator. That's what Scripture means when it says, Vayachal Moshe. Not Moses implored the Lord, but Moses got God out of his vow. This is an astonishing and humorous portrait of a fallible God trapped by his own law of justice, which unless modified will lead to total destruction, of a God dependent upon the ingenious intervention of a human partner to help him escape the devastating dictates of his own divine law. This portrait of a morally evolving and even dependent divine being, whose law can and should be subjected to moral critique and modified if necessary, stands at a very great distance from Stoic conceptions of divinity and the static, unchanging divine law of nature, the natural law. The Stoics would have found the idea utterly incongruous. They would have scoffed at the rabbinic notion of a fallible deity. Indeed, they would have removed the incongruity by just declaring Israel's God to be no God and rejecting Israel's divine law as no divine law. But for their part, the rabbis rejected the Stoic conception of divine law. They insisted on the conceptual distinction and incongruity between it and their law, the biblical divine law. And they wanted others to take note of that distinction as well. Because they experienced this incongruity as funny rather than distressing, they intensified it with humor. They told stories, as we've seen, and I've given you only a handful. They told stories in which God and his law defeat or circumvent truth. They celebrated the irrationality of the dietary and purity laws. They showcased a morally evolving deity attentive to human needs. But beneath the laughter, the rabbis had a serious purpose: to remind themselves and their fellow Jews that God is not static and absolute, an impersonal principle in nature, but dynamic and responsive. That his law is not an immutable rational order, but a continually evolving set of moral guidelines responsive to facts on the ground. That to say God is true is not the same as saying that an impersonal rational truth is God. And that an overzealous devotion to an abstract and absolute truth, immune to critical moral inquiry, is nothing short of idolatry. In the medieval and modern periods, the Greco-Roman binary, that chart on your first page of natural law and positive law, will enter into and become controlling paradigms in the conceptual world of the Christian West and also in the Islamic world. We in the West are heirs to that tradition now. The Stoic paradigm, which was once revolutionary, no one thought of nature as orderly and rational before the Stoics claimed it was. But that Stoic paradigm now has become like a second skin to many people in the West. The average person in the street, if you ask them, what might it mean to say that a law is divine? They will tell you, and I know this because I do it a lot, they will tell you, well, a divine law, I guess, would have to be true. And it would have to apply to everybody the same. It would be universal. And it would have to make sense. It wouldn't have anything weird in it, so it would be rational, and it would never change. It would always be the same. They give you the Stoic definition of divine law: rational, true, immutable, and universal. And so for us, too, the rabbinic construction of divine law, these stories can seem incongruous and even a little ridiculous. For a law that's divorced from truth, is particular and sometimes arbitrary, is subject to change and evolution, is surely human. But who says Perhaps there's something to be gained from bringing the rabbinic construction of divine law out of the shadows, from considering the possibility that we can speak of a law and a text as divine without insisting that it is universal, absolute, immutable truth. Holy books never laugh, Charles Baudelaire said, to whatever nation they belong. To be sure, the authors of the letter of Aristeas and Fourth Maccabees and the Jewish philosopher Philo would agree with this claim. Holy books are serious stuff. They enshrine rational, immutable truth. To laugh at truth is nothing short of blasphemy and threatens a collapse into chaos. But Baudelaire's claim must be qualified. Books deemed holy according to a particular and quite Greek conception of the holy, as rational, immutable, and true, are disinclined to laugh. But books deemed holy according to a different conception of the holy, that is not aligned with rational, immutable truth, have plenty of room for laughter and play. Thank you so much for your attention this evening, and we have time for questions.
Well, thank you so much, Christine. This is a wonderful project. I'm still trying to wrap my head around the idea of the rabbis as being funny. And so what you're saying that they consciously, it's so hard. I mean, rabbinic humor, it almost reads like rabbinic texts that aren't humorous. You know what I mean? I'm just wondering to what extent. First of all, were these men serious most of the time, but were using humor as a tool, as a theological tool in a way? Or was there another more playful side to them that we don't usually talk about?
Those are all really good questions, and there's 3 questions in there at once, and so let me take them apart piece by piece. So we, I think, are told that certain books are holy, and therefore the authors of them were serious, and that we need to read them seriously. They would never have made a joke. And I just don't buy that. I just absolutely don't buy that, and I've been teaching rabbinic texts long enough, and especially when you put on the voices, then people hear how funny it is, Instead of having, we also do these texts a disservice by translating them in high Shakespearean English. Would thou come to me, Moses? And that's not it. That's not what it is. The Hebrew has different registers, and sometimes the Hebrew is very clearly being sort of coarse or crass, and if you translate it appropriately and use the correct tone of voice, you can actually hear the humor. However, it's quite legitimate for people to wonder whether I'm imposing my own sense of humor on these texts. So I have 2 answers to that. One is, I know that I'm not imposing my own sense of humor because I have none. But the second response is this. We can take the temperature, the humor temperature, if you will, of different cultures. There are 2 wonderful books, a book by a man named Steve Hallowell about Greek, it's called Greek laughter, Greek laughter, and then another one by a classical scholar, Mary Beard, called Roman laughter. And they looked at texts from Greek, well, the Greeks, of course, gave us a Greek comedy, so that's wonderful. Looked at texts where figures actually laugh, and then say, so what were they laughing at? And you can start to make a list of what in that culture it made sense for people to laugh at, right? So I've been doing this now with rabbinic literature as well. I gathered all this material, all the stories, or any place where a character laughs at something. It's always incongruities to begin with. But there are very specific things that they laugh at. And lo and behold, if you look across the 3 ancient cultures, the Greek, the rabbinic, the Roman, they laugh at the same things. Large animals. Large animals are hilarious, particularly elephants. Large numbers. He jumped 400 parasangs in the air. Animals doing incongruous things. Cases of mixed identity, slaves or women who outwit their masters. That's a huge thing in the old comedy, and we have lots of rabbinic stories where the rabbi's slaves outwit them. If you read them seriously, like, oh, look at that, Rabbi so-and-so had a smart slave. No, you need to understand that in antiquity, that was like a situation comedy today. That's like us seeing a banana on the ground and someone walking towards it. You know what's going to happen, right? You know it's going to be some slapstick humor. So I started to develop this code, and I've got this list of certain disabilities are funny. That may not be politically correct for us now, but certain disabilities are funny and some were not. So hunchbacks are funny. Blindness is not, right? And you start to get a list. And once you have a list of cases where people or characters actually laugh at some of these things, then let's say I come to a story and they're telling a story. I see an elephant. and I see that elephant's doing something bizarre, and then he jumps 300 parasangs in the air, and he lands on a guy with a hunchback whose slave is smarter than he is. That's a funny story, right? So you begin to realize that these are the signals or the signs of humor. So I've started to collect things, and once you are alert to it and you start to know what the code for humor is, then you see it everywhere. So that's one part of this project. But another part of this project goes deeper than humor into what I call play. So I actually think that what's going on here is a certain posture or attitude towards the world that is vigilant against absolutism of any kind. I think the rabbis are suspicious of anyone who declares they have the truth. You can have a lot of the truth, but 100% absolute truth, and I think they love to poke holes in that. And I call that the posture of the jester. The jester is the person in the room who is always vigilant against any absolutist claims of truth, whether it's the scientist and the rabbis poke fun at scientists and empirical knowledge, whether it's the philosophers who think they have found the one single truth and the rabbis poke fun at them, whether it's the rhetoricians of the Greek tradition who stand in court and say there is no truth, everything is chaos, the rabbis will poke fun at them too, because that's also an absolutist claim. And so I see them as really, it's not so much humor as play. They want to keep things dynamic and keep things in play, as if to say, don't be so darn sure of yourself. I don't know how clear that was, but I say that because of the final part of your question. Were they serious sometimes and funny other times? That claim has been made by a scholar of rabbinics who's looked at a lot of the funny stories in the Talmud, and he says, oh, look at this. They're very serious when they do all their legal argumentation and work, but they take a break, and they do this funny stuff, and they tell stories about their great logical heroes, but they tell these stories where they're really crass, some of them, and crude and vulgar, but they're funny in that old way. And they were clearly just sort of, combining the serious and the comic. And Plato did the same thing. He had serious dialogues, but then Socrates would sometimes be foolish or silly or whatever, too. They're combining the serious and the comic. My argument is no. The legal argumentation is also play. Why? Because they never let you settle. You might start with a dispute between two characters. Rabbi X says that a minor girl has the ability to acquire a divorce document through her courtyard, and Rabbi Y says she doesn't. And then the argument begins, and we seem to settle it, but then someone will raise another possibility. Well, what if it's a Tuesday? Well, what if it's wet? Does she acquire it because it works like a hand to acquire her document, or does she acquire it because it works like an agent? But can minor girls have agents? As you work through and you finally get to the end, sometimes even the original dispute disappears. You find out that the people you thought had a dispute really agreed, and there was no dispute at all, and there was some misunderstanding. In other words, it's all play. It's an infinite game, and you never are allowed to settle anywhere. This is why, after the Talmud just reached its closure, not because it was finished, but just because they stopped, it was in the Middle Ages that they had to come up with codifications of law to actually tell you what the law is, because you can hardly figure it out by looking at the Talmud, right? It's this endless questioning, don't be so certain, you're not God. You may have reason, and that's great, but reason doesn't always get you truth. And even if it got you truth, well, who can really say? And I think that that's this attitude of the jester of suspicion of absolutes, which I think is healthy. If we had all the answers, why would we get up each day? Yeah.
Yeah. No, we need to microphone.
This may go to what you just said to Ellen about women proving men wrong, or some of the subordinate proving a superior wrong, but I always go back to the beginning of Exodus, when the midwives, tell Pharaoh, "Oh, these Hebrew women, they're
so hardy.
They're so hardy. We can't get the babies," and the Pharaoh just believes them. And I always thought that was funny.
It's
and
hilarious.
Maybe it's just me, but that well, is it Pharaoh because he's a guy and just knows nothing about babies? Is it that these two women are outwitting Pharaoh? There's so much humor in that text to me as a reader, and I love it on so many levels. But is that one of the humorous texts?
Absolutely. There's so much humor in the Bible. Now, thankfully, people have started work on this in the Bible before the Talmud, so I'm sort of trying to convince people to come along on this ride in the Talmud. But the Bible, there's been some great scholarship in the last 20 or 30 years where people have realized, listen, we have this crazy idea that a holy book can't be funny. And because we approach it with reverence, we are not prepared to see the humor in it, and it's full of humor. The book of Jonah is the greatest satire of a prophet. You know, when you think of Jeremiah and Isaiah, right, who wrote chapters and chapters of scathing condemnations, trying to call Israel to be true to the Torah, and, you know, they're continually unsuccessful, right? The Israelites won't listen and the temple's destroyed. Jonah, God tells him to go to the evil Assyrians, right? He turns and goes as far as he can in the other direction. God says, no, you really can't escape from me. Come on, you're doing this. He's so reluctant, he doesn't want to do it. He walks into town, he utters 5 words, you know, another 3 days, Nineveh destroyed. And he turns, everybody, the cows repent, the king repent, the whole place repent. Jeremiah and Isaiah would have given their eye tooth to have been as remotely successful as this reluctant prophet who could care less and went to people who had never even heard of God and uttered 5 words, and even the cows were repenting, right? It's a total parody. It's so funny. The other one is Abraham and God arguing over the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah. And again, it's not impossible for text to be funny and serious. That's the other thing we have to realize. You can deliver a very serious message through humor. So when I say things are funny, I'm not saying it's only funny or it's merely humor. I'm saying and it's funny, right? It's powerful and it's funny. So in that particular story, as you may know, God decides he is going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. But he says, you know, I'm going to tell my servant Abraham because he will need to teach future generations justice, and therefore I need to give him a lesson in justice. And who teaches who what by the end of that story? So he comes down and he tells Abraham what he's going to do, and Abraham says, listen, who am I but dust and ashes? But you are the Lord of justice, and you would never do injustice. You would never treat the innocent and the guilty alike. You would only punish the guilty and acquit the innocent. That would be unjust to treat them alike. So I'm sure that if there were 50 righteous, you would, what would be justice? Spare the 50 righteous. What does he say? If there are 50 righteous, you'll let the whole place go. And he's pulling one over on God, right? He's just said, I know you won't treat the innocent and the guilty alike, but for the sake of 50 righteous, will you spare the whole city? And God said, oh, well, you have 50. That's kind of a lot. Maybe I shouldn't destroy the whole place. And he says, 40. What about 40, right? And he gets them all the way down to 10. And God's saying, yeah, 10. Yep, you're right. If there's 10, then I'll spare the whole place. That's not justice. That's mercy. So God starts off by boasting that he's going to teach Abraham a lesson in justice, and it's Abraham who teaches God a lesson in mercy. These kinds of ironies and twists, the Bible is full of them, and there's some great work that's being done now to show that. And God, the God of the Hebrew Bible, is not the omniscient, omnipotent God of Western theology. He doesn't know what human beings are going to do. He's really kind of surprised when they eat that darn apple. He figures out now that they've got free will, and that human free will is a huge limitation on his power because he can't control them. And it's this struggle all the way through, and that's funny. They've done studies to see if there are certain things that are universally funny, and there's this one study that has shown that there are 4 things that are universally funny. I can't remember the first 3 because I only cared about the 4th one. And the 4th one is a fallible deity. Every culture sees a fallible deity as funny. I cannot believe that the rabbis and even the biblical writers, in depicting God as getting annoyed and angry when his plans don't work out and when he can't carry them off, or when the rabbis describe God as trapped and he has to go to Moses to get help, or sometimes they have stories of God debating with the Heavenly Academy over some point of law. Is this particular thing pure or not pure? And it'll be God saying it's pure, and the whole Heavenly Academy is against him, saying, no, it's not pure. And he says, oh, I don't know. Look, we better go ask Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. He's really an expert when it comes to the purity laws. And so they summon him to come to the Heavenly Academy. And they're depicting God in all these ways. They know it's funny. They know it's funny. These are universally incongruous and funny things.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. Oh, of course, it's the person furthest away from me.
I was going to talk about this. Okay. I guess I'm wondering, when does playfulness evolve into ridicule?
Uh-huh. Right. So that's why I like John Morial's piece, because he helps us understand that the 2 different reactions, the negative one wants to dismiss or destroy, or like they're distressed by it, so they ridicule it, they want to end it, right, the incongruity, whereas when we really enjoy something, we want it to continue. And so I think that can be a helpful way to sometimes recognize that the rabbis weren't When they laugh at their fallible deity, it's an embracing laughter. When Antiochus, the tyrant, is laughing at the Israelites' God, they're saying, he's not divine. How can you even say he's divine? He's not a God. He's just not a God, because the incongruity between my idea of the divine and your God is such that I've just canceled your God. He's not a God. I resolve the incongruity by just getting rid of, that's just not a God. Whereas the rabbis see that incongruity and they want it to stay in play. They say, our God is all these things. He doesn't look anything like your definition of God, and we like it that way. We think it's funny, but funny in a way that we want to affirm over and over and over again, because while we think God is true, we don't think truth is God. Two very different things. But you're right, sometimes it's a little hard to tell. And the rabbis certainly have their biting humor as well. They certainly ridicule things as well. They engage in that. It's not God, but they do engage in biting humor, sometimes quite vicious humor.
Is there a connection between this and what we would call Jewish humor today, as we look at the contemporary humorists, many of whom are Jews?
Yeah, I think there could be. I think that there's been a lot of work done recently, actually, on Jewish humor. There's a new book by Jeremy Dauber. Can't remember if it's called, I don't think it's called Jewish humor. It's got a better name than that. It's got a funnier name than that. I don't remember. So I haven't read it yet. It has just come out. I'd like to see what it is, but I am trying to make a larger argument that this represents a certain posture towards the world, not just that people see incongruities and think they're funny, but I think it really is a way of saying there is no stable truth that you can rely on. That also doesn't mean that there's nothing, right? They're not saying, oh, everything's relative and nothing matters. Things aren't funny if you don't have a stable point, but the stable point shifts. And the world is dynamic, and don't trust yourself, and always be able to question yourself. I think that's where the humor comes in. To be able to laugh at yourself, because if you don't, then you start to think of yourself as absolute and always right and always correct and always true, and you start to get really serious and boring. So be always able to laugh at yourself. Anything else is, again, idolatry. The minute something becomes sacrosanct, something you can't question, something that's absolute, you've made it a god. And that's idolatry. So I see their humor as a way to battle the idolatries of the everyday that we all engage in, where we decide certain things can't be criticized, right? Certain things are absolute. We have moral certainty about things. Can I tell one great story? So this is a good example. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Deuteronomy 21. It's this really unpleasant law about a stubborn and rebellious son. So Deuteronomy 21 says that if a man has a stubborn and rebellious son, and he will not obey his voice, will not listen to him, then the mother and the father can take the son out to the elders of the gate, and they can say, this, our son, is a glutton and a drunkard, and the people will hear, and they will stone him to death. Okay. Now, believe it or not, this was an advance in its time, because the father didn't have absolute right over the life and death of his children. He at least was being required to subject them to a legal proceeding, since the elders who sat at the gate was sort of the court of the time. Okay. But by the time the rabbis come around, this to them was untenable. This was a terrible barbaric law. And so we go through this incredible interpretive, legal interpretation of this law, some of you may be familiar with. They start off by saying, if a man has a son, that's the opening verse. Well, if a man has a son, it has to be a son. It means he can't be 13 years old yet, because once you're 13, you're a man. It says man has a son, so he has to be under the age of 13. But under the age of 13, you're not actually responsible for the law. So it must refer to a boy who's just hit 13, so he's responsible under the law, but he hasn't yet sexually matured into a man, and that takes about 3 months. So the window of time I have to bring someone for them to be liable under this law is a boy, not a girl, from the age of 13 and 3 months. Or if he sexually matures in less time, then even a smaller window of time, 5 years or 50,000 miles. So that's one thing. So that's the first thing. And it says the mother and the father will take him out, so both have to agree to do this. It says they will walk with him, which means neither of them can have any injuries in the legs. They have to be able to walk beautifully. And they say, this, our son, which means neither of them can have any visual defects at all. They have to be able to point him out. He will not obey our voice, so they can't be dumb or mute or have any speech impediments at all. He's a glutton and a drunkard. What does that mean? Well, a glutton is somebody who eats like 20 ounces of meat and drinks 8, I forget the size, of wine. It has to be Italian wine because that's particularly strong and intoxicating. He has to steal it from his father's property and eat it off his father's property in the company of people who are thorough rich, etc. It goes on and on and on with all of the qualifications before you can have liability to bring someone up on this charge, right? And at the end of what goes on for pages and pages of qualifications, tell me this isn't play, they get to the end and they say, quite proudly, there never has been and there never will be a stubborn and rebellious son. Why was this law then written, they ask. Why was this written? Why was it put in the Bible if there's never going to be one in all of human history? And the answer is so that you would do what we just did, so that you would interpret it and earn a reward, so that you would go through that moral calculus of modifying it. Very good. Most people stop explaining the story there, but I like the very last line. After saying that, one rabbi, Rabbi Yonatan, stands up and he says, "No, there was one. I saw him and I sat on his grave." And the reason I love that is because the rabbis are congratulating themselves about their moral certainty. This is a bad and evil law, and we got rid of it. Aren't we morally certain and morally pure? And Rabbi Yonatan says, don't be so damn sure. There might be one time in all of human history you're going to need that law. I saw it. I sat on his grave. And that's what I mean. There's always that. We can be 99.99% sure of things and they can guide our lives, but never be so sure that you make yourself God, right? And that, I think, is the jester and the humor in the rabbis.
It's a great place to end unless someone had, right? We can end now. A great ending. Dr. Hayes, thank you so much, Christine.